Please welcome to the stage Edgar Oliver.
On a May morning of 1983, my sister Helen and I were getting off a train in Savannah, Georgia, accompanied by our loony friend Richard. We were coming back to bury our mother. Richard had met us in Penn Station the night before, dressed in a golfing outfit. His only luggage was 2 cases of champagne, bags and bags of burgers and fries from McDonald's, and 24 canisters of laughing gas, and a device with a balloon attached that was used to pop them. So we were all in a pretty strange state when we got off the train that morning in the pine woods on the outskirts of town where they had built the new train station. This was the train station from which Mother and Helen and I had left Savannah 9 years before, presumably never to return. I had been 18 at the time. I was now almost 27. It seemed like a century had passed. A sense of awe and reverence at being back in Savannah overwhelmed me. Also, a feeling of terror. Mother had taught us throughout our childhood that Savannah was a trap to be escaped from at all costs. Mother had, to my mind, just made the ultimate escape. Mr. Schwarzer had found her on the top floor of that big old rooming house in Georgetown. She was crouching, leaning against a table, looking out the window. Mr. Schwarzer had come upstairs for the rent. He didn't realize at first that she was dead. He tapped her on the shoulder. Now that Mother was gone, we didn't know what would become of us in Savannah. Would that house that we had all 3 abandoned 9 years ago entrap us? Mother had taught us that we were different than anyone else, that other people wouldn't understand us. We were strange. We were artists. We should beware of other people. But secretly, I think Helen and I were somewhat excited about the prospect of coming back to Savannah. Now we were New Yorkers. We were looking forward to making a splash in town, to being the wild bohemians from up north with our loony friend. So we took a taxi into town, past the old Laurel Grove Cemetery and into the shadows of the live oak trees. At a certain point, we got out and walked. We were in a complete daze. Richard suggested that we go to a bar. It seemed like an excellent idea. We found a bar on River Street. It was 11 a.m. and happy hour was just beginning. In Savannah, happy hour lasts from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. Richard ordered us all double vodka stingers, and the waitress brought us a tray of miniature meatballs. On our third or fourth vodka stinger, we realized someone else was sitting at a table in the darkness of the bar, and Helen and I gasped, "It's Mother's old friend Milton!" And almost simultaneously, Milton exclaimed, "Why, it's the Oliver children!" We joined Milton at his table, and Helen and I told him the sad news of Mother's death. Milton said, "Louise is dead?" And then he began to weep, big, slow tears that rolled down his cheeks and splashed onto the table. I was so happy to see Milton weep for our mother. Suddenly, the door opened, and in walked Burke Macklin. Burke was a shy and effeminate man, refined and bespectacled, although it had never been spoken of. All throughout my childhood I had known that Burke and Milton were lovers. Burke saw us and he stopped dead in his tracks, and this look of terror swept over him. And suddenly he turned around and flung the door open and fled. And we all jumped up and ran out after him, Milton crying, "Burke, it's the Oliver children!" And there was Burke Macklin, a thin, frail man in a dark suit, running away with all his might up the railroad track beside the river. Burke cried out again, "It's the Oliver children!" And this made Burke run even faster. We watched as he disappeared upstream amidst warehouses and smokestacks. Then we went back inside. Milton said, "Burke is ashamed to see you. The reason we come here to drink is that they serve parolees, even though it's against the law." And we were shocked. We thought, well, what could possibly could shy, effeminate Burke have done to be sent to prison? And Milton told us. Burke had always lived alone with his mother, Miss Marguerite, in a big old red brick house on Charlton Street. Nobody had been inside the house in years, not even Milton. Burke said that Miss Marguerite did not like visitors. One afternoon, Milton came by to get Burke. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. For some reason, he tried the knob, and the front door opened. For some reason, Milton went inside. He began wandering about, calling out, "Burke, Burke," very softly. And then he thought he heard a sound coming from upstairs. He walked upstairs, and the sound grew louder, the sound of someone weeping. He opened a door, and there on a bed he saw a little old lady, naked and covered with bruises. She was tied to the headboard, weeping. It was Miss Marguerite. Burke had been beating his mother mercilessly for years. No one knew quite what to do, so the whole thing was hushed up, and Miss Marguerite was sent away to a home to protect her from her son. But Burke began to act very strange after that. He took out a huge insurance policy on the house, and then one day he wandered through the house, scattering balled up pieces of newspaper soaked in kerosene, and then he set fire to the whole thing. The fire was put out easily. It was obvious arson. There was no choice now but to send Burke to prison. He was so frail, though, they didn't keep him very long. He had just gotten out. Helen and Richard and I looked at one another. We were flabbergasted. We had thought we were going to be the ones to scandalize Savannah. We had no idea what we were up against. Suddenly, we realized it was late afternoon and our cousin Gibson was expecting us. So I ran to the phone in the back of the bar and called. And Gibson said, "You children get over here right away. But first, stop at Johnny Gannam's and pick me up a gallon of ancient age. They'll put it on my account." So we bade goodbye to Milton. Gibson lived in a little house out back of his mother's big house. His mother was our great-aunt Addie May, recently deceased, the dauntingly imposing organist of Christ Church. Gibson had been born club-footed, the result, Mother told us, of congenital syphilis, inherited, Mother assured us, not from Addie May, but from her dissolute husband. Recently, the disease had gotten so bad that both Gibson's legs had been amputated. We found Gibson sitting in his wheelchair with a shotgun across his lap, polishing off the dregs of a jug of ancient age. So he cracked the new jug and poured us all drinks. Gibson was someone I had always admired in my childhood, but I'd never been able to get to know him because Mother was so paranoid and suspicious of relatives. But we seemed to hit it off really well with him that night, and he took an instant liking to our loony friend Richard. He poured us all drinks, and he was crying out, "Mercy, children, mercy," over and over. It was a sort of toast of his. When we were all quite drunk, Gibson said, "A few months back, when Big Raymond died, I was sitting here waiting for Little Raymond to arrive from Baltimore, just like I was waiting for you tonight. It began to grow very late, and I'd just about given up on Little Raymond when a cab drove up to the door, and the driver got out and said he had someone in his cab who didn't have any money, and would I please pay the fare?" Gibson assumed it was Little Raymond, so he paid the fare, even though he was somewhat shocked when the driver told him it was $60. And then the cab drove off, and instead of Little Raymond, Burke Macklin walked in the door. He had just gotten out of jail and had been driving around all day looking for someone to pay his cab fare. Gibson said, so I poured him a drink, and then I had to pee, so I was peeing in my pishy pot when all of a sudden Burke Macklin knelt down on the floor in front of my wheelchair, and before I knew it, he was giving me the best damn blowjob I'd ever had in my life. Helen and Richard and I looked at one another, and we realized that in terms of shock value, Savannah had us completely outclassed. All of a sudden, Gibson said that he was taking us out to dinner and would we please help him to his car. So we hoisted Gibson up onto his artificial legs and helped him as he staggered out the door. We got him seated in the driver's seat of his big old black-finned Chrysler and placed one of his artificial legs on the gas pedal and the other on the brakes. At this point, bombed as we were, it began to seem to us rather odd that our legless, drunken cousin was going to be driving, but Helen and I didn't know how to drive, and I don't think Richard did either, so we got in the car, and Gibson turned on the motor, and then he announced gleefully that the battery in his hearing aid had just gone dead, and he had forgotten his glasses. And then he stepped on the gas, and the car shot backwards out the driveway and up onto the lawn of the house across the street, coming to a stop just before it crashed through the facade. Then there was a moment's silence while Gibson switched gears. And then he gave a maniacal laugh and stepped on the gas again. And the car shot forward off the lawn into the street, barely missing the hoods of parked cars. We were screaming at the top of our lungs, but Gibson was laughing even louder. For some reason, miraculously, this continued for several miles until suddenly the car veered around a corner and crashed into a ditch just as Gibson hit the brakes. You could hear us all panting in the quiet of the car. And then Richard jumped out shouting, I can drive, and started dragging Gibson over onto the passenger side. We made it to the restaurant and had a delightful and exhilarating dinner, during which none of us mentioned our near brush with death. We stayed in Savannah for 6 weeks after that, and every day there was as incredible and astounding as that first day had been. We didn't bury Mother there. We pretended to bury her ashes in Bonaventure Cemetery, but for some reason we brought her back up north with us. Now, when I think about Savannah, I'm happy that Mother raised us to be proud that we were strange.